Hello and welcome to the second day of the FMM Conference. Apologies for the slight delay. There's very little leeway now for 2 or 3 minutes in delay as opposed to the actual conferences. But I'm very happy that we are here now, all of us, and that we'll be discussing about the inequality effects of the COVID-19 crisis of Corona, the session titled Into Sharp Relief, with this double meaning, this double sense of the Corona crisis throwing existing inequalities into sharper contrast, perhaps, into a starker sort of view, and at the same time, of course, in the sense that post-Keynesian economics has, or I hope we will discuss today, has a lot to say on relief regarding economic policy on inequality. Yesterday already, I think we've discussed a lot about fiscal, monetary policy, inflation, and monetary policy, and shown that post-Keynesian economics has a lot to say, or had a lot to say definitely, on the previous crisis, on the economic and financial crisis after 2009. I think the same is true for inequality. We have a lot of analysis in post-Keynesian economic thought on the issue of inequality, on the issue of how inequalities have contributed to cause the financial and economic crisis, and also the effects that this crisis have had on the crises have had on inequality. I think it's interesting with regard to the pandemic that this poses, in my view at least, and I hope we'll discuss more about this today, a new challenge for post-Keynesian economics. We have a lot to say about financialization, about fiscal policy, about austerity, about monetary policy, endogenous money, all these issues. Inequality, we have a lot of long history thinking about functional inequalities, inequalities between factors of production, personal inequality, and increasingly wealth inequality in post-Keynesian economics thinking. How to shut down an economy, which areas we consider essential, which inequality effects such a fundamental cut in economic activity has, at least in my view, we've had less thinking about until now. And I'm very happy that we have 3 presenters here today who have thought about this and who will give us insights into their views. I'm going to present our speakers today just before they speak, so you have a little bit of a change also in voices that you're hearing during the presentation. Each of them will be presenting for about 20 minutes, and we'll have time for discussion at the end. I think what has worked very well yesterday was for questions to be posted in the chat, or if you are interested in raising a question personally, please raise your hand, or also just say in the chat that you have a question that you would like to speak up at the end. All right, and with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Stephen Fazzari is a professor of economics and sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. He was chair of both departments. His publications are too numerous to list, especially in a setting like this and with the time constraints that we already have. But suffice it to say that he's a Keynesian macroeconomist with a focus on demand-led growth and inequality, and extensive past research on the link between business investment and finance. He's a fellow of the FMM network, and despite the great distance, a very regular attendee of previous conferences. And I'm very happy that you're here today, Stephen. The floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm speaking to you here from St. Louis, Missouri in the United States. It's 8 in the morning. Not so bad. Had more coffee than usual. So hopefully I'll be coherent. I'm not really a morning person. Let me share my screen. I'm glad to be here, in some sense here, thinking about Berlin, when normally I'd be on the other side of the Atlantic. It was interesting to get the invitation to speak on this topic today, and about inequality in particular, and how how that plays out in the current COVID crisis. I'll focus on the United States and I'll focus on employment. I also want to recognize my co-author, one of my students here at Washington University, who's joined me in this project, Ella Needler. So let me just jump back here. That what we had. Let's see. I think I jumped a slide. Okay, so here we go. In the United States, as well as around the world, but in particular here in this country, we had a historic decline in both economic activity and employment. The first U.S. COVID-19 diagnosis was on the 20th of January, and that was preceded by several years of steady employment gains. There's some debates. We're, of course, right before a major presidential election, so there's a lot of debate about what the economy looked like prior to the crisis. But no matter how you see it, there were fairly steady gains in employment, averaging about 200,000 jobs a month, the way that the numbers are reported here in this country, before the crisis. When the crisis hit in March, we lost 1.4 million jobs, which would have been a really awful month under any circumstances. But in April, it was just unbelievable. Almost 21 million jobs lost. And just to put this in context, Miriam was talking about some of the comparisons between different kinds of crises, which will be a central theme of my talk today. The total job loss in the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009 was just under 9 million jobs. So more than double the job loss of the Great Recession just in 2 months. The worst month in March was less than 1 million. So you can see how unprecedented this collapse was. But the initial bounce back was really quite large. There was this so-called reopening of the economy in the late spring and early summer. So in May and June together, 7.5 million jobs were gained, where 7.5 million people went back to work, so to speak. And I put on the slide here, you can see, was it surprising? Well, I have to say, from my point of view, I was doing some simple projections at the time. It seemed surprising. It seemed like we couldn't add that many jobs in a single month or two, but it probably shouldn't have been. As Miriam's talked about, the dynamics of this crisis are really very different. And with the quick imposed shutdown, we had the massive drop. And basically, when the restrictions were relaxed, that the economy came back rather quickly at that point. So there was this big gain, but then things slowed down. So between July and September, the monthly job numbers declined, and we remain at this point, by the latest data at the end of September, almost 11 million jobs, or about half the total loss, below the February peak. So there's still a big gap a massive gap in the labor market here in the U.S. And also what's happening now is a rise in longer-term unemployment and permanent layoffs. Initially, a lot of the job losses were identified as temporary, and people did go back to work quickly. But in a sense, the so-called low-hanging fruit has been harvested, and there's a general view now that the employment recovery will be slower, and we're still in a very severe situation. Let me just show you one chart. Most of the data I'll show you today is our own analysis, but this one I took from the Opportunity Insights website, which is quite an interesting site for various kinds of looks at inequality. So there's 3 different employment profiles here shown, starting in January and going through September, and the 3 lines you're seeing there are high wage on the top, middle wage, and then low wage at the bottom. And you can see how low wage workers, according to these estimates, they're estimated by zip code. It's a geographical stratification of the data, are still much below. The high wage group is almost recovered, but middle wage is still down quite a bit. 6% on its own would be thought of as a huge recession, and almost 20% for low wage workers in the U.S. So clearly it's been an unprecedented decline, and shows very significant dimensions of inequality. So I want to talk a little bit about some aggregate results, and then I'll move to discussing inequality. So one thing in the context of this group that I enjoy speaking with every year is thinking about the supply or demand sources of a macroeconomic crisis. And in our network, most of us talk about demand-driven crises. It's certainly been the focus of my research for my entire career. But in this case, there is a more complex causation that's taking place. It's obvious that we have significant supply dimensions to this crisis. Initially, there was a lot of talk about supply chain disruption, that with the virus originating in China, that various international supply chains would be interrupted. I believe that's happened to some extent, although maybe less so than we might have thought in the spring when these things really started to emerge. A bigger concern, in my view, would be how health concerns led to a lockdown of production itself, really supply constraints. I would take the U.S. auto industry as an example of this, where because of concerns about workers infecting each other in the factory, the plants were shut down. But that actually was resolved reasonably quickly in the sense that the various production platforms were modified to try to make things safer. And so you don't really hear a lot about, say, spread of the virus at work or things along those lines, or businesses that are shut down because of the safety concerns for their workers. The shutdowns seem to be largely because of demand effects. So we go back to the part of the style of macroeconomics that those of us that work in this network are most familiar with. And there are, broadly two different sources of these demand effects. One is that there are infection fears that, I speak for myself, I haven't been to an indoor restaurant in probably since mid-March was maybe the last time, early to mid-March, and because we're scared of getting sick by these kinds of things. And I think that's a big source of demand shock in this situation. But also, importantly, what I'm calling multiplier effects, spillover effects. When people lose their jobs, they are not going to be able to spend as much. And so you've got these supply effects, these demand effects. An interesting question about which one dominates. Well, there's lots of ways to think about that, but here's a very simple one, which is simply to look at prices. Use the basic, Econ 101 aggregate supply demand model. A negative demand shock would have lower prices. A negative supply shock would have higher prices. And you can see this trend here for the U.S. Price index. This is the personal consumption price index with taking the energy and oil out for the so-called core prices in some sense. And what you can see here is that there's a very clear drop from quite a smooth trend in the crisis. It looks very much like the demand shocks dominate, although one can't deny that there are supply dimensions to this crisis as well. So why is this relevant? Well, as Miriam talked about, post-Keynesians have things to say about these things. That this means that much of the unemployment is Keynesian in some sense, as the result of insufficient demand, and that's going to drive our policy analysis. It also justifies comparison with other demand-driven cycles. And in particular, as we want to talk about inequality in this session, we can look at inequality in a relative sense. That in general, the view, of course, is that recessions hit less advantaged groups more heavily, whether that be low income, underrepresented minorities, women versus men, these different kinds of ways of stratifying our understanding of the impact of recessions. But in particular, I think it's interesting to look at how this crisis differs from others. And what Ella and I are doing in this work is focusing on the Great Recession versus the COVID downturn. So I've already mentioned the first point here. The prevailing view is that recessions hit disadvantaged groups harder. What kinds of comparisons are we seeing out there? Well, one is a gender comparison. I know Bettina will talk about this in more detail in the next session or two of the panel. I've mentioned my sociology colleague here at Washington University, Caitlin Collins, who's talked about a lot of these issues, and in particular about how childcare problems created by the shutdown of schools hit women more heavily than men on average, and also occupation, that some of the service sectors of the economy that are shut down more heavily or hit more heavily in this crisis tend to be more dominated by women. Also about the stratification by income, again, occupation, where service sector jobs that are hit more heavily now in this crisis tend to be lower paying, and also the ability to work remotely. I think most of us have been continuing our work. maybe not quite the way we're used to doing it. I'm a person who likes to work in my office, and I haven't been doing very much of that, but certainly can continue to work from home and have done so for months and months. But that tends to be correlated. The ability to work from home or work remotely tends to be correlated with income. So lower income people are facing bigger problems in doing this. And also this kind of idea, this inequality idea, and many people have mentioned this, but I especially would cite Jamie Galbraith, who's written extensively about this issue, that when the demand for services from high-income households drop, that spills over in kind of a multiplier sense to low-income households. So really the shift towards service sectors in some ways is personal services and things like that for more affluent individuals. And when these people decide not to consume those services because of fears of infection, that's going to spill over to the low-income sector of the economy. And then race and ethnicity, of course, minority groups usually do worse in a recession. Is COVID-19 different in this sense? And what we want to do is look at some evidence from the U.S. job market on this topic. So let me talk a little bit about measurement. What we want to do is compare inequalities in labor market outcomes in these two recessions. Now, how do we do that systematically? Well, again, I think the labor market's a good place to look because it's obviously a key indicator, an important indicator, and the data are easily available by different demographic groups. But there's this dynamic aspect to the problem because the impact depends really both on how quickly or how deeply the employment falls, how deep the recession is, but also how persistent it is. And this is a big difference between the COVID recession, which has been extremely deep, as I mentioned at the beginning, but so far, some of the dynamics have really been quite fast, versus the Great Recession, which was not nearly as deep at its lowest point, but it was very persistent in terms of a slow recovery. And many people would argue, myself, that we have a secular stagnation now that's actually was continuing well beyond when people were talking about the recession. So we have to try to sort this out. Here's an example using one of our data series. This is female employment of women in the United States. And you can see the two crises there. I've put some trend lines on that, as you see in general, employment of women were rising. Those numbers are, I guess, in thousands. So we're before the Great Recession, we were rising up there, and we're about 68 million, and dropped down to about 66 million, about 2 million jobs lost. But you can see here how persistent this job loss was. It went around the bottom and actually never really regained the previous trend. Here's the COVID crisis, which is, again, stunning in the sense that how deep, but you see the very fast bounce back here too. So now, how do you kind of put all this back together? Well, here's our answer. We have our statistic calling job months lost, which is essentially kind of an integral that basically we're measuring this area between the previous trend of jobs and what happens in a recession. And you can see I've highlighted in red in these two cases. I don't think it's immediately obvious here which one's bigger. I'll show you in a minute in some sense. I do want to mention one important factor in our work, which was that in principle, you might have just done a straight line over here and say, well, we were 68 million and we got back to 68 million a few years later and do that area. But, the trends are actually important, and I'll have more to say about this in a minute. And we obviously we haven't finished the COVID crisis. We don't know where this is going to go moving forward. The expectation is it's going to slow quite a bit. We move off in this direction. So we had to choose a cutoff date for the Great Recession. For COVID, we'll use all the data we have through September. For the Great Recession, we're using 36 months to try to get a rough sense of what's going on here. I will tell you the results are not very sensitive to that choice, and in a way surprisingly insensitive to that choice. So that's a methodological issue, but one that really turns out not to matter as much as maybe we would have thought. So this is our measure, job months lost. I do want to point out about trends here. So these are two different education groups. This is workers with a college degree, and these are the lowest education group we have in the data, less than high school. And you can see this is the Great Recession data here, the months around the Great Recession. And you can see how the trend is important. So if you ignored the trend, and just say, for example, looked at the peak of employment for college workers with college degrees and then go back to the point where it recovered, you'd say, well, there was almost no loss. But clearly that's not true. That this group was growing relatively quickly, and the trend is heavily influenced in this sense. And there was a loss here. Similarly with the less than high school, you just continued this over, you might never get back to the same level again. In fact, we saw that was true with some of the series we looked at. But again, this was generally trending downward. And so we are adjusting all of our calculations, for these pre-crisis trends. And the trends aren't dramatically different between the two recessions, but we estimate them separately, so we get a better sense of what job months lost look like relative to the pre-crisis trend. Okay, so there we go. Now we can talk about some results, and then I'll finish up with a few implications. So this is an aggregate comparison. If we look at this using this method that I've just talked about on a 36-month horizon, this integral, this job months lost, was 277 million. That's the number of jobs per month, multiplied by the number of months. We're just adding up that area under the curve as you saw before. So far in the COVID crisis, 109 million, less than half. Obviously, the crisis is not over, and this number is going to rise dramatically. I did a very rough projection of what COVID-19 might look like 36 months out. I took some of the longer-term forecasts about recovery in the labor market and interpolated between them. I would actually view this as a reasonably optimistic projection at this point. But what you can see is that very likely the job month loss number in the COVID crisis, once we see it as in some sense finished, or at least once it gets to the 36-month horizon, that it could easily exceed the Great Recession. Not maybe dramatically, again, with the idea that the COVID crisis is much deeper but much faster, where the Great Recession was more persistent. So we'll see how that all plays out. The issue here, though, broadly, is what I'm talking about is the short-term direction of causality, and then we'll talk about the long-term at the end, but that the macroeconomic conditions that we face in the COVID crisis are likely to both create and magnify inequalities. And so we'll look at, basically from the macro crisis to inequality here, and look at the evidence for employment. So I'm going to show you, I think, 4 tables like this one. Let me just explain the numbers with our key results here. So I'll just use the Great Recession example. So this is gender, the first table here comparing men and women. And so we start with the idea, well, what was the initial share of jobs? You see it was meant a little higher in the Great Recession, but close to half and half by this. The share of total jobs at the peak before the recession is this first line. This is the share of the job months lost by this measure, again, the 36-month horizon for the Great Recession, and this is the ratio. So the idea here, and this is the key number we want to focus on, is that if the share of the job months lost is equal to the share of total employment before the crisis, this ratio is going to be 1. If the ratio is bigger than 1, as you can see it is for men here in this case for the Great Recession, then that means that men were disproportionately affected. And so you see in this case, the Great Recession hit men harder than women. What happened in COVID? Same kinds of calculations, a little bit of a shift in the shares, but a big difference in the share of the job months lost. It flipped pretty dramatically, with the women now taking a much bigger hit, and relative to their share of the labor market, or the share of the jobs initially before the crisis hit, in some sense. The question here, I think, is why. I've talked about some of these things in principle before: inequality in childcare and how that's affected employment, service sector versus manufacturing. Manufacturing was hit harder in a relative sense in the Great Recession. So this is kind of supporting that view that the inequality dynamics in the COVID crisis have been different across gender, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Bettina. I do want to mention again that this 36-month horizon that we've just chose somewhat arbitrarily for the Great Recession hardly changes this at all. I think we looked at up to 60 months here, and these ratios are really quite stable there. So the story is pretty much the same, regardless of the horizon. And, with the COVID crisis, it's a little harder to do that robust assess, but we've tried that, kind of excluding the last month or two, and again, not much change, at least so far. What about race and ethnicity? Clearly, inequality but actually not so much different in the COVID crisis, if anything, a bit less. So remember, these ratio statistics here would be 1 if there was the job loss was equivalent to the share of jobs. And you see, yes, for sure, white workers being below 1, that is, they're seeing less job loss than the other race ethnic groups in the chart, Black, Hispanic, and Asian. But it doesn't change much. If anything, it actually declines a bit in the COVID crisis relative to the Great Recession in this context. But it is quite significant. The inequality, I would argue, is quite significant in this context, just pretty similar across crises. Here is an interesting one on age, especially the youngest group is hit exceptionally hard in the Great Recession, but even harder in the COVID crisis. And you see, yes, the kind of young, middle young here, 25 to 34 years old, being hit hard as well in the COVID crisis. Middle-aged workers actually doing much better here. I think a lot of that has to do with the opportunity to work remotely. It's actually interesting also to see what's happening to the older group, 55 plus in this case. Just a couple of interesting things. One is that notice the share has gone up quite a bit. The older workers in the U.S., people are working longer. There's a lot of issues about retirement and things like this. So interestingly, the share of older workers in the labor force is rising quite significantly. But also notice that while the older group was really very relatively less severely affected in the Great Recession, they're almost at 1 in the COVID crisis. And I think there's a couple things here. One is that older people, of course, are more affected by the infection, or would have more severe results. And so we wouldn't be surprised if we saw a drop in labor force participation. And indeed, if you look at the data on labor force participation, that's part of what's happened. This job months lost, basically, when the job could be lost either because people are laid off and are forced to leave their job, or they choose to leave in some ways. And I think that's what's going on in part with this older group here. Education, it may be the most dramatic difference in this case. In a way, it's really surprisingly stable across the education groups in the Great Recession. That basically the job months lost were almost the same as the share of jobs for the different education groups in this sense. Maybe a bit surprising in the Great Recession context, but clearly it's just completely different in the COVID crisis, where the lower education groups are taking a much bigger hit. And look here at the college degree numbers. And interestingly, remember I mentioned about that trend. This is what made us look at the trends to some extent. At first, maybe we're missing this because we're ignoring the trend. But this accounts for the fact that the college degree group was growing faster, and we're looking at deviation from trend. And even so, the job effects of the COVID crisis are dramatically lower than the share of college degree workers in the labor force. Okay, so I'm getting close to the end here, which probably makes sense. I think we're getting relatively close to my 20-minute limit. So let me talk about what we're calling the long-term direction of causality, really the other direction that is saying, well, how do the inequalities induced by the COVID crisis are likely to affect future outcomes? And so just a few points here. One is structural change due to the new experiences of the crisis. I'm mentioning Joe Stiglitz here, who we're going to hear from tomorrow or this evening. Think about people meeting on Zoom as we were doing versus business travel. So all those wonderful people that made that great breakfast for me at Hotel Stiglitz aren't doing that this year as a result of this. And so we're going to have these structural changes that are going on, and there will be inequality effects of that in the general sense of women, minorities, and young workers, and especially lower educated workers in the service sector, likely seeing that their jobs might be, in a sense, changed in a long-term structural sense, even after the virus crisis passes. And then short-term unemployment has long-term effects. So you lose the capital of the match with your employer when you lose your job. You have gaps in your experience, which hurts your ability to re-enter the labor force later on. Lower income is going to, multiply through and have different kinds of effects on your household, your family, your individual welfare, so that in the longer term, the unequal effects of the crisis are likely to persist going forward. And then things that are related to my own research, probably why folks asked me to join this panel, is that, income inequality, slowing demand growth for the long term, thinking about these problems of secular stagnation. I think we're very much still with us before this crisis. They'll be magnified in its aftermath. And also, in terms of some of the recent work that I've been doing, how slower demand growth spills over to the supply side, affecting productivity, affecting labor force participation. The hysteresis effects, and this paper I have with Piero Ferri and Anna Maria Variato that came out in the Cambridge Journal last spring is a start on a longer research project emphasizing these kinds of things. And again, magnified because the inequalities in these processes, the inequality in longer-term secular stagnation and the effects on productivity, magnified by inequalities. So let me finish up with a couple of slides about policy implications that Miriam talked about in her introduction. So the first thing is the importance of supporting unemployed workers. The crisis remains severe around the globe. In Europe, in the United States, we're seeing infections rise. Even if infections were not rising, we still have only recovered half of a massive job loss in the U.S. context. The first point is to mitigate human suffering and to contain the magnification of these inequalities we've talked about. And so just for basic human decency, we need to be providing significant support for unemployed workers. That also has the macroeconomic benefit of containing these multiplier effects. The big stimulus bill passed by the U.S. Congress in April, I believe, the CARES Act, a coronavirus Aid and Recovery something or other Act is what it stands for, was actually really very important. And the summer was much less severe and the bounce back probably a lot faster because of this massive fiscal stimulus, in particular, remarkably strong support for unemployed workers. But as I pointed on the slide, there's been recent disappointment that despite the persistence of the problems, the U.S. government has not been able to come together to extend what were temporary supports for unemployed workers in these last few months. We'll see what happens next Tuesday and the few days afterwards as they're trying to count votes. My expectation is if the Democrats win, there will be another large stimulus, but we'll see how that all plays out. It is very, very important, and it's really, and in some ways, a disgrace that we haven't been able to respond more actively to what remains a huge issue. Also, institutional responses to inequalities specifically magnified by COVID. And here I'm just going to emphasize the gender dimension. The United States is very unique among almost any country around the world, as my colleague Caitlin Collins tells me, in having virtually no support for child care and family leave. And that is it's really awful in many respects, and something that very much needs to be addressed. And the inequalities of this crisis emphasize this point. Second kind of slide here on these things that we have, more severe inequalities. So again, aside from macroeconomic issues, just on the basis of social justice itself, we need a response. We needed it before the recession. The recession is magnifying this response. And then the part that relates mostly to my personal research agenda, focusing on aggregate demand effects, but again, beyond the short run, that this is not just about a crisis that will go on for a few months, or as the virus persists longer, maybe, several quarters into a couple of years, but it is going to affect the economy going forward. Those longer term implications I talked about. As I said before, the problem of secular stagnation, which is was very much with us before the crisis, is only going to be magnified by the COVID crisis. The response there, I think there's a variety of them. One is renewed emphasis on infrastructure, especially for environmental initiatives. Again, I cite Jamie Galbraith here. And also addressing inequality to support demand growth. I think the most important reason to address inequality is because inequality is unjust. But a supporting role here, the focus of some of my research, is how rising inequality, with more and more of the income being, and the growth of income being, in the top of the income distribution, not being recycled back into demand, is fundamental in this secular stagnation process, and again, magnified by the crisis. And finally, fiscal austerity will not work. It's just a travesty in the U.S. case that the arguments about fiscal austerity at this time are coming out and blocking the response to the unemployment problem that we have. It's something that that just needs to change. The CARES Act was an exception. It was exceptional. It was very, very large and really very generous on the unemployment side of that. I'd be happy to talk about that more in discussion if people are interested. But we backed away from it, as is often the case after the worst of the crisis appears. The same thing happened in the Great Recession, and that's just not gonna work. And I hope that we can move forward beyond that. So that's it for me. I appreciate again the chance to be on the virtual plenary stage at the FMM conference, and I will certainly welcome comments and questions. And I'll pass the floor back to Miriam. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Steve, for your awesome presentation. And we'll have time to discuss this in more detail and go into the directions that you suggested, I hope, in the discussion at the end. But for now, let me introduce our next speaker. Daniele Tavani is Associate Professor of Economics and Director of Graduate Studies at Colorado State University. He also, despite his young academic age, is extremely well published and highly productive. He's a macroeconomist that focuses on growth and distribution and technical change. He has worked both on classical and post-Keynesian models, incorporating the public sector, and on classical models with externalities, with very prominent co-authors as well, and is also now already publishing with his students. Something that is very, very dear to my heart as well, to make sure that the tradition continues, also as Stephen Fazzari is doing, of course. Daniele Tavani is also a regular attendee of our conferences here at the FMM in Berlin. So even though we spared him the jet lag this time, I'm afraid it's probably the earliest of the presenters for him. The panel started at 7 a.m. for him. I'm very happy that you still managed to be here with us, Daniele, and he will talk on path dependence, the COVID-19 crisis, and inequality in the United States.
All right, let's go.
That's how we work.
Thank you for inviting me and to the FMM for the support it has given me over the years. It really has been an intellectual home away from home for me since my first FMM conference in 2013. What this talk is about is some reflection work inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic in light of what I learned over the last few years thinking about growth and distribution. My talk is confined to the United States, but I hope that the general thrust of the talk would be of some relevance for the experience of other countries as well. And the first part of the talk draws from work that I have done with Luke Pitak, now at Belmont University. Next slide, please. This is the roadmap. I'll skip it in the interest of time. Let's start talking about the before times, as Kai Risdall from Marketplace, the NPR show in the United States, has called them. If we look at secular trends for the United States, what we see is a falling trend in labor productivity growth, a downward trend in the labor share, down from over about 2/3 of GDP to less than 60%. Downward trend, as I said, in labor productivity growth, even though you see an increase between the 1980s and the early 2000s. Then you see this U-shaped pattern in the top one share in total wealth, but definitely a marked increase after the 1980s. And finally, a marked increase in the capital income ratio. And this last measure is robust to different measurements of the capital income ratio. Next slides, please. So these are what I call the Piketty facts, right? That motivated the capital in the book Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. And his explanation is a very simple and draws from the neoclassical growth model. Basically, if the endogenous rate of return to capital R is greater than the exogenous growth rate G, this determines an increase in the capital income ratio. And with elasticity of substitution higher than 1, this implies a rising profit share. There is, however, a classical political economy alternative to this. Consider an economy with two classes, one class of capitalists who own capital stock, earn profits, consume, and save, and a class of workers that work they save and accumulate capital stock, and they consume as well. In such a model, a balanced growth condition requires, on the left-hand side, the accumulation rate, which is equal to the saving rate times the output capital ratio U times the profit share, or 1 minus the labor share omega, to be equal to the growth rate of labor productivity, gamma, plus the growth rate of the labor force. The important thing, one of the important things that I'm going to emphasize in this talk is that in classical political economy, technical change is conflict-driven, meaning that capitalists respond to an increase in the labor share with faster labor productivity growth through innovation. And this, as a footnote, has been shown to apply both to the direction and the intensity of technical change. I can talk about this later in the discussion. So the political economy explanation of the Piketty facts goes as follows. Neoliberal institutions and rising globalization, and by neoliberal institution, I mean deunionization, financialization, monopoly power. You can think about many of these forces, and globalization and rising globalization have put downward pressure on the labor share omega. This increases the accumulation rate because it increases the profit share, but the long-run growth rate has actually fallen. And so restoring balanced growth requires a decline in the output capital ratio, which implies, the Piketty capital income ratio rising. Next slides, please. What about wealth concentration? Well, this is, the famous Pasinetti 1962 theorem, which says that the worker's saving rate is irrelevant for long-run growth, but of course is relevant for the distribution of wealth. And a two-class wealth distribution arises provided that, a small, savings per unit of profit are greater than the saving rate of workers, which is empirically true for the United States. And finally, there is a long-run inverse relation between the output capital ratio and the capitalist wealth share. And the intuition is the following. The long-run output capital ratio is inversely related to the total savings to income ratio in the economy, which in turn increases in the capitalist wealth share. And so this is a point that has been made before, also by Eder and Rehm, 2020. Next. So let's move to post-Great Recession trends. This figure is another very familiar one. It compares the actual GDP trajectory in black with two series of potential output calculated by the Congressional Budget Office. The solid gray line, which is the trend the CBO projected in 2007, before the Great Recession, and the dashed line, which is the trend the CBO projected in 2017. When compared to, when compared to 2017 potential output, the Great Recession looks like the usual V-shaped recession. But if the relevant comparison is with the 2007 trend, it looks much more like an L-shaped recession. Antonio Fatas has made similar calculations for economies in the European Union. This suggests that the Great Recession has had effects that are much more long-lasting than, say, the unemployment numbers would suggest. I think there's little dispute nowadays that we live in a path-dependent world where shocks can have permanent effects, especially on levels, but perhaps on growth rates too. Next slide, please. And so, for those of you familiar with classical and post-Keynesian economics, no surprise here, the two graphs I showed you fall squarely within the realm of the debate about long-run versus short-run effect of aggregate demand. In a couple of recent papers, Luke and I have attempted to provide a unifying framework in the spirit of what Tom Michael has called irenics, which is the reconciliation of opposing theological doctrines. In this case, such doctrines are in demand-driven viewpoint. The irenics involves you looking at aggregate demand affecting firm beliefs about the state of the economy. Accordingly, the utilization rate, or the output capital ratio U, is not only endogenous to distribution, but it also depends on beliefs that can be influenced by fiscal policy. It is path dependent, in other words. As such, fiscal policy has a coordination role in the economy. In a depressed economy, fiscal expansion will have permanent level effects on the output capital ratio, but also progressive effects on distribution, both the functional distribution of income and the distribution of wealth. And these effects, the long-run growth effects will depend on the way that technical change works. And they will be temporary with a Caldo-Verdorn technical change specification, but most likely permanent with a conflict-driven view, under a conflict-driven view of technical change. Next slide. So, but by way of an assessment, as you might have intuited, the before times were not that great. They were marked by a secular decline in the labor share and labor productivity growth, a secular increase in the capital income ratio and the top wealth share, and by strong path dependence or hysteresis in the aftermath of the Great Recession, certainly in levels and possibly in growth rates. Next, please. So enter the COVID shock, and I'm just plotting a few top-line numbers. Late February 2020, even without looking at the mortality and morbidity numbers, which I'll talk about in a second, the pandemic has had a devastating effect on GDP per capita, down 10%. Of course, this is up until yesterday. Now we have some job numbers, so maybe we can talk about that later. The prime rate employment ratio is still down more than 5 points even after bouncing back. And the labor force participation rate, which fell substantially also, and it was also already in a downward trend. The one puzzling feature seemed to be what's happening to the labor share. As you see, it fell during the Great Recession. It stayed about constant up until beginning of 2020, and then it started rising. So let's clear this up before we move forward. So next slide, please. The increase in the labor share appears to be due mostly to compositional effects, and this is basically the same chart that Steve already showed, even though his chart is updated. Mine is not. Most of the job losses, as Steve emphasized already, have happened at low-paying sectors, and many workers, especially women, have dropped out of the labor force altogether. And this figure taken from Opportunity Insights website showed us job losses by income quartile. And you see very little job loss in the top income quartile, while still large job losses in the lower two income quartiles. And so it seems that there are strong compositional forces behind the increase in the labor share. And so I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that. Next. I want to talk a little bit about the policy response, which, as Steve emphasized already, was remarkably strong. And it involved basically three things. Like first, some direct payments directly to households, and most of these payments were made on April 15th. And these they were somewhat effective at restoring consumption spending for bottom income quartiles, which jumped back, from minus 30% to about minus 5% in June. They were not very effective for spending of top income quartile households, which is still 20% below March levels as of mid-June. Maybe there's some up-to-date data on this. Spending in durable goods actually increased relative to pre-pandemic, but spending for in-person services was still about 60% lower than January as the end of April. And this is in a recent paper by Guerrieri, Lorenzoni, Straub, and Verning, what they basically have argued is that if the consumer spending is directed at sectors where employment did not fall by much, the multiplier is going to be low. Okay, next, please. So the next piece of the CARES Act was the so-called Paycheck Protection Program, which was aimed at providing direct relief to small businesses, although with many exceptions, by allowing to fill out a form with payroll expenses and providing them with the funds in order to maintain employment. The rollout of the PPP has been difficult. The program ran out of money quickly, and many moms and pops businesses had actually difficulties obtaining funds. But some bigger firms were able to intercept a good chunk of the allocated money. And this, again, from Opportunity Insight, Judge Chetty's website, they estimate a small difference impact of the program and found that it was quite small, about 2% relative to larger firms. The final piece is the unemployment insurance, which was a very generous measure, but unfortunately it ran out pretty quickly. So it was a combination of regular unemployment insurance up to 26 weeks, pandemic emergency unemployment compensation about 13 additional weeks, the extra $600 in unemployment insurance to ensure workers received 100%, in some cases over 100% of their pre-pandemic salary. There was a large discussion about this in the United States. Then there was the pandemic unemployment assistance for gig workers, people working for Uber or Uber Eats and so on, who didn't qualify for UI or PUEC. And the available evidence suggests that UI is a very successful automatic stabilizer, and it doesn't seem to reduce incentives toward job search. This is a very famous Journal of Political Economy paper by Ricchetti, 2008. The Economic Policy Institute and the Urban Institute have argued that UI has I multipliers up to 2 in a recession. So pretty successful. Taking stock, assessing, in a way, we see that direct transfers to household seem to have had some limited effect at restoring employment. And this is, in my view, this is standard Keynesian economics. The transfer multiplier is the lower, the higher the marginal propensity to save. And high-income households actually saved most of the relief checks. There might be some political economics involved into this universal program. We can talk about this in the discussion. Maybe the government wanted some buy-in from richer households in order to pass this measure. But what it seems to have happened is that the multiplier is likely limited, especially because people with health concerns don't go out spending in the service sector, which is the most affected by the pandemic. The payroll protection program seems to have had minor employment effects for the target firm population. And one of the issues that people have emphasized, this is an NBR paper by Granca et al. 2020, is that most loans were taken up by firms that were not planning to reduce employment by much. On the other hand, as Steve already said, UI was generous. It ran out of money too quickly, and it was successful at reducing the employment bleed out. Next, please. So taking stock of the policy response, I think that the unemployment rate, which is, last time I checked, was 7.9%, is artificially low because lots of people are still out of the labor force. And we've seen this before in the aftermath of the Great Recession. What's hugely important, and I think Bettina will talk about this, there are deeply concerning trends in women's labor force participation rate, especially because of partial idiosyncratic school closures across the country. Direct transfers do not seem to work that well if most of the public still has health concerns. The transfer multiplier maybe is lower than one can think, and yet a new round of stimulus is of paramount importance. There are negotiations. I don't know. They're probably not serious anymore between the House, the Senate, and the White House. The Senate is in recess now. I think that direct government spending, especially to cover for state fiscal deficits, I think we have a looming fiscal crisis at the state level in the United States, as well as infrastructure, would be very effective. And unemployment insurance is important as we move into the winter and the service sector, again, is at risk of losing employment. So now I mentioned that I was going to say something about the total costs. Well, the numbers are not pretty. More than 226,000 deaths as of October 23rd. Well, actually, no, this is from yesterday. I should have changed the date. The replication rate is larger than 1 in the vast majority of the United States, and there's more over the 8.8 million infections. Now there is this new paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association by Cutler and Summers, in which they try to do some dismal arithmetic of the likely total cost of the pandemic, including mortality and morbidity. There might be some questionable ideas about, the value of a statistical life, but what they place it at is about 90% of GDP. Next, please. And so we are sort of gearing up to draw some conclusions. I think it's very difficult to think about long-term recovery without getting the virus under control. As mentioned before, wrong-headed fiscal restraint may actually send the economy back to where it was early in the pandemic. And if you followed my argument at the beginning, we're back to the coordinating role of fiscal policy. I think it would benefit greatly the country to have a clear communication strategy by the White House to restore faith in the public about handling the pandemic, the safety and effectiveness of an eventual vaccine, plus meaningful relief, especially to state governments and unemployed, to minimize the lasting demand effect of the crisis. And as I said before, an expansionary fiscal stance will have beneficial distributional effects on both income and wealth. Let's draw in some conclusions. it seems clear that the COVID crisis has hit the United States at a time in which the economy was already vulnerable, plagued by secular stagnation, wealth concentration, and lackluster economic recovery from 2008, especially distribution-wise. And I think that the longer it takes for new, large, and properly targeted relief, the more the effects of the COVID shocks are bound to be long-lasting. Without adequate fiscal policy going forward, it's not hard to predict that the recovery will be slow, with anemic demand, depressed wage share, and further wealth concentration. But, you must expect the deficit hawks to screech very loudly, especially if Biden wins the election. And these level effects are bound to translate into growth effects if the wage share falls, and this reduces labor productivity growth going forward towards like the medium to long run. Thanks. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Daniele, also for keeping time so excellently, despite the technical challenges. Apologies for that. So we'll now move on with the final presentation in this panel by Bettina Kohlrausch. We are very happy to have you here. Bettina is head of the Institute of Economic and Social Research in Germany, the WSI. So the scientific head, and she is professor of sociology at the University of Paderborn. Goodness gracious, the University of Paderborn. She continues to do research despite her now leading role of heading the WSI, and among many other things, since her only brief tenure there, she has published a Corona survey with co-authors. Her area of expertise, especially in work, sociology and socioeconomics, I would really say, of work, education and inequalities. And without further ado, I would ask you to present.
Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. As Miriam already said, I'm not an economist, I'm a sociologist. So maybe I come from not totally different, but maybe slightly different perspective. And my presentation is on gender inequalities during the crisis in Germany. And when we try to understand what generates or what structures gender inequality before the crisis, then we have basically two mechanisms or two problems. We have, on the one hand, a gender pay gap, and on the other hand, a gender care gap. We do know that in most countries, in most capitalist countries, there is, not only capitalist countries, by the way, there's a gender pay gap that women earn less than men. And we have a care gap, which is describes the fact that women do much more care work than men do. And of course, these both gaps are interrelated, and these both mechanisms are interrelated. And now, sorry for throwing some feminist theory on you, but if we try to understand why these gender pay gap and gender care gap are interrelated, feminist theories state or hint to the interrelationship between capitalism and patriarchy, because the argument here is that the development of capitalism is very, very strongly interrelated with the development of a reproductive sphere, which is actually a critical requirement to increase productivity of male productivity on the shop floor, and thus implement a more efficient way of capitalist production. So, as a result, in capitalist societies, we do have a gender division in paid productive labor, and this is often considered to be rather male labor, and unpaid reproductive labor, and this is often considered to be female work. So, and this in turn leads to the fact that women are more responsible for reproductive work, of course, weakens their position in the realm of productive work, in the realm of the labor market, because the dominant pattern of organization of work, for example, full-time working hours, are often incompatible with reproductive work or with care work, with taking care for children, for example. So this is the one point. But moreover, and in line with this idea that productive work, that we have a strong differentiation or a strong line between productive and reproductive work and the productive and reproductive sphere, certain tasks and competences, for example, caring or interpersonal interaction, associated as being female work. And even if this is organized within the productive sphere, even if it's organized as paid work, this is often considered to be less professional, and it's often devaluated, for example, by low wages. And this leads to a situation in which, on average at least, women often contribute to a lower extent to the household incomes, and that weakens, of course, their bargaining power when it comes to the distribution of care work between men and women. And this leads to a situation in which women more often reduce their working time, their paid working time, and take parental leave. And this, of course, weakens their labor market position and their career perspectives. So if we are looking, where are we now? What does the crisis to this to this situation? We can consider that this this might change this interrelation between gender pay gap and gender care gap, because of course due to the lockdown we experience a reorganization of productive and reproductive sphere. At least we experience a situation in which we do not have the strong separation between both spheres anymore, because we work at home, we take care of our children while working. Men and women alike have to stay at home, and this might change this whole arrangement, or even not. Let me say, and this is what we try to find out. And let me say just a few words about the data we are doing it with. We conducted an online survey among members of the German labor force, or not someone did it, Kantar did it for us, but we paid. And this survey was conducted as a computer-assisted web interview. And the sample was basically a quota sample. And if you're interested in weighting and stuff, we can talk about this later. And we conducted so far 2 waves, one in April and one in July. Both were, of course, during the COVID crisis, but in quite different situations, because we had, during the first wave, really a lockdown. Schools were closed. And even not as strict as in other countries. But when we talk about care, the children had to stay at home. And in July, we had eventually schools would open. It's not comparable to normal schooling, but at least parts of the week, children could go to school or to the kindergarten. And we interviewed 7,677 people during the first wave and 6,039 during the second wave. So let me show you some of our results. Unfortunately, until now, only descriptive results, but we are working on this. We ask the participants in the survey who provides the larger part of childcare at the moment and who provided it before. The figures are presented as percent. And if you look at this, you can see that at any point of time, people were asked, women provided the largest part of the care work. Or the largest part of women provided the largest part of care work. So this has been around 60% before the crisis and has come a bit less during the crisis. So the first thing we can say is that women had provided the largest part of the care work, and of course the care work, when we're talking about the amount of hours, has become much more during the lockdown. So this is why I would say women did the most of the work, which of the care work during the lockdown. But still, we do have a certain percentage of men, or we can see that the percentage of men doing the largest part slightly or nearly doubled, and increased from around on average 6% to on average 12%. And actually in Germany we had quite a big debate about the 6%, and a discussion whether this might change the whole gender arrangement, and men are on the move now to finally to do their fair part of the care work. And so we try to find out who are these men who suddenly or who do more care work than they did before the crisis. And unfortunately, we did not ask in the first wave whether we didn't ask what the individual income has been. What we asked for the household income, and we found out that these men who do the higher part of the or the larger part of the care work now are often men with low qualification but very high household income. And we think that this, or we assume that these are households in which the women, because men with low qualification probably do not earn so much, so these are probably households in which the women earns or contributes the larger part to the household income, which actually supports the argument that the bargaining argument. These are households in which women, when it comes to bargaining, who stays at home during the crisis and take care for the children, have probably better bargaining arguments because they earn more. And so this could at least explain why there is an increase of men doing care work, which is also supported by other studies not conducted by us. However, I wouldn't talk about a trend here, because if you look at June, we already see that the share of men doing the largest part of the care work is decreasing after the lockdown. Then we had a further look at a very interesting group. This is the group who shared care work to equal parts before the crisis. And if we look at them, we can see that now only 60% of this still do so. And we can see that even couples which shared equally before the crisis now, if they don't do this anymore, women do, or most often women do the larger part of the care work. So we have an effect we call retraditionalization here. And we also found that this effect is more pronounced among couples with lower household income. And this again is an argument, or supports this argument, that bargaining power within couples is really a strong mechanism generating gender inequalities. And then finally, we tried to find out what this means for the situation of women on the labor market. And here, and we ask them, we ask the participants how many hours they worked before the crisis in March, April, May, and June, and not paid working hours or official working hours, but really how many hours they worked. And what I'm showing you here are only men and women with children in need of care at home, so a certain group. And what, of course, we can see that also before the crisis, women worked less than men, 10 hours, on average 10 hours a week. And what we see then is that this gap between men and women is increasing during the lockdown in March. But what we can also see is that this enlargement of the gap of working hours has been perpetuated after the lockdown. It doesn't become, it doesn't, increasement of the gap is very persistent. even in the moment when working hours are going up again because the lockdown or because people would slightly eventually go back to work. So here I see really a danger that women are for also in a long-term perspective excluded from the labor market. However, I spent quite a lot of time on running regressions on income loss. We only ask people, or my dependent variable has been whether they stated whether the people had income losses because of the crisis. And there is no, and I couldn't see that women have higher, or state that they have higher income losses than men. In contrast, at least in the beginning of the crisis, we see a significant difference between men and women, and men have higher, or state significantly more often that they have income losses. I cannot really explain this finding. I think that maybe this is just, maybe we have to wait what we will see. We are going to the field in a couple of weeks, and maybe then we will see, maybe it just takes a little time that we see this effect on working hours, also on the labor market, and also when it comes to income. At the moment, it doesn't really make sense to look at unemployment rates because these are really still quite low because we have the short time scheme in Germany. So I think the more interesting variable here is the income loss, but I don't really see anything at the moment here. But I expect that women will eventually also suffer from income losses and will be more excluded from the labor market. So let me conclude. We do have gender pattern of or the gender pattern of distribution of care work during the crisis, or before the crisis, continue also during the crisis. I wouldn't say, I think these are the same pattern which become more prevalent during the crisis, but it's not really a new development. We saw that the largest part of care work, which is more time consuming and probably less compatible with paid work, has been provided by women during the crisis. So also the burden of school closures and the closure of kindergartens has been mostly taken by women. We experienced pattern of retraditionalization in some families, and when we also saw that when women have less bargaining power, they're more likely to retreat from the labor market. So I would say what we can learn, not only for the crisis, but in general about gender inequality, if we want people to share care work in equally and fair, then we have to increase the bargaining power of women. We do need to increase wages of women. I really think we need a really decisive mechanism for gender equality is the labor market and the wage structure. And we really have to stop to evaluate female work. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot to all of you for your excellent timekeeping, and because that now means that we have plenty of time for discussion. I already saw that in the chat. I'm not sure whether everybody on the live stream. We have about 250 attendees in total, both registered and following us on the live stream, which is roughly what we would expect at our conferences as well. So we're very happy with that number. Despite the early time in the US. So we are now going to move into discussion. So I would ask our panelists to join us again. And I'll start off with some discussions that have taken place on the discussion board, and I'm very happy for others to join us and ask them questions directly. So I'll start with a question from Daniele, who asks a question to Steve. In fact, What do you think of the forecasting of the Fed in St. Louis, expecting an unemployment rate of 33% in the US?
That was an can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. That was a very interesting forecast. That was the Jim Bullard, who's the president of the St. Louis Fed, who emphasized that. This goes back to the point on one of my early slides about being surprised by the quick bounce back. When we saw what happened in April with the job losses, the unemployment rate, I believe, jumped to something just under 15%. And then the continuing claims for unemployment, or the new claims for unemployment, which were reported on a weekly basis, were very, very high coming through there. And many of us, myself included, I thought 33% was excessive, but I thought it would go over 20%. And in fact, it went the opposite direction. So I think we're talking about the May jobs report when the unemployment rate actually fell, and we got back something like 4 million jobs, and then in June we got back another 3 million. So we had over 7 million jobs recovered in those months. And again, looking back on this, I think people should have realized the dynamics were different here. The idea of adding 4 million jobs in a month or 3 million jobs in a month just seemed so out of line with past experience that given the losses we had in April, it seemed like that wouldn't be possible. And I think that's where Jim was going with that forecast. But again, the loss in April was totally unprecedented. So, just the immediate shutdown, and then rather quickly, some recovery here. So a lot of people were surprised by that. But again, looking back on it, this was just a different kind of recession altogether.
We now have two questions actually from Robert Blecker. So I would ask Robert to join us and perhaps ask his question and comment. And there was also actually some debate happening in the comments. So I think it would be useful to move this to the recording. So would it be possible to add Robert Blecker for him to join us? So I have another question from Eric Kemp-Benedict, again to you, Steve. I'm curious whether you have considered linking to an epidemiological model. The idea is to connect public health behaviors to both the spread and to labor force participation and consumption. There's a post-Keynesian model with that feature unnecessary. It can also be used to look at expansion of capacity in the health sector.
I agree in principle. Oh, sorry. I agree in principle. Have I done it? No. Will I do it? Probably not, in the sense that I want to get back to my research agenda on demand-led growth and inequality. That said, I think in many, it's correct that this is an unusual crisis. I mean, it's something that I mentioned a number of times as I did in my presentation, that you have this mix of kind of basic economic issues that a lot of us have talked about regarding things like multipliers and propensities to consume, and the linkage between productivity and labor shares, and these kinds of relationships we usually talk about. But on top of that is this whole epidemiological perspective that certainly affects what's happening. So as Daniele mentioned, you have high-income households actually cutting back much more in consumption than low-income households, which we normally would not expect, but it's virus-induced. People who have discretionary, where a lot of their expenditure is discretionary, are able to cut back because they're not going to go to restaurants, they're not going to travel as much, they're not going to go to various entertainment venues and things like that, whereas people who are living with more basic needs don't have those options. So the interaction between the epidemiology and the economics here is really quite significant. I will say, though, as I mentioned in that response to Danny, that despite the unusual dynamics in the first few months of the crisis, I think things are going to become more understandable or more typical as we go forward now. Now, of course, the virus is still going to be with us and still going to be having effects, but now we're, I think, in a situation where it's more longer-term things and more of the economic forces will dominate the epidemiology going forward.
Thanks. Okay, I'm not 100% sure whether Robert has accepted the invitation to join us actively. Apparently, you need to do that.
I had to install an app, and then it got blocked by my virus protector. Welcome to the new world, and hello, everybody out there. Well, Steve, I'll keep it short. I was just noting that today the new numbers came out for gross domestic product in the third quarter for the United States. And as expected, but maybe more than expected, it is a big bounce back. But I think it looks better in the headline number than it really is. I wanted your comment on it. The headline number is that the increase in GDP in the third quarter was 33%. And that's about equal to the drop in the second quarter. But everyone needs to understand, I'm sure Steve knows this, that in the United States, we do this a very strange way. We take the quarter-to-quarter change, but express it at an annual rate. So it really exaggerates things, especially in an extreme situation like this. I did some calculations while you all were talking, and in quarter-to-quarter terms, it's only an increase of 7.4%, and that is following decreases of about 12% in the previous 2 quarters combined. So we're still very much down. And compared to 4 quarters ago, that is third quarter of 2019, we're down 2.9%. But there's still this headline number, 33%, and I can just imagine Donald Trump saying, see, biggest growth of GDP ever. It's a V-shaped recovery, nothing to worry about. Hopefully the voters have already voted and made up their minds. But I'm curious, is this number surprising to you? Is this new information? How does it affect your analysis?
So that it is interesting. I'm sorry. We okay?
Yeah. Do you want to maybe add your comment, Daniele, as well, Robert, or is that cleared up?
I think that's a minor point Daniele and I could discuss some other time.
Great. Sorry. Apologies, Stephen.
Oh, no problem. I mean, Robert basically told this story in some respects. So just today, I actually, saw the question in the chat and pulled up the new data. This is, again, the new world here with everybody sitting at their computer. And so at least my calculations, Robert, is where real GDP is down 3.6% from the peak in the first quarter. So still, in other words, in addition to this growth, so we now have where we would be right now, not quite as deep as the worst of the Great Recession, but probably the worst recession still, except for 2007 to 2009 in the post-war period. Even if we took the current numbers, in addition, as I mentioned in the presentation, we've only gotten about half the jobs back. So it's interesting what the implication here is going to be on productivity in some sense. So there's that fact. And then you asked, well, am I surprised? No, I was surprised by the job numbers, as I mentioned in response to Danny's question earlier, because I didn't appreciate how quickly we could jump back. But once you saw these job numbers, it was going to be pretty clear that you'd see something similar to on GDP. So, I think this is old news. I also checked the stock market, which is dropped a bunch yesterday and is maybe up a little bit today, but not moving dramatically in response to this news. So I think this was really totally anticipated by those of us who follow these things in some sense. Of course, how it affects voters, well, I was glad the GDP report was so close to the election in some sense, because no doubt it'll be a talking point. Although there is one simple point you didn't mention. If something drops 50%, it has to rise 100% to get back to where it was.
Right.
So there's a nonlinearity in these kinds of things as well. So yeah, it'll be spun over the next few days. But on the economic side, not surprising.
Thanks a lot. Sebastian, do you want to ask your question now?
Yes, I'm fine to do so. Hello, everyone from my side also. Actually, Daniele was already answering that question in the chat, but maybe people who only watch the live stream will want to have this discussion as well. So I was asking myself, so Daniele, you were mentioning that you think that these transfers only have a low multiplier because people are unable to spend or fear to go to restaurants and so on and so forth. But basically this session is also about inequality, right? So the first impact that this should have is at the very least to cushion a little bit the effect of market income losses that these people face. And in the medium term, maybe this turns out to increase the aggregate demand effect, at least as soon as these people are able to spend again. And this should be compared also to an infrastructure program that would also have some delays, you know, in getting the money spent, and also the inequality impact of this infrastructure investment is not clear from my side. Maybe you can comment on this.
Right, Daniele, are you with us?
I think Daniele is still muted.
Doesn't look like it. Now he's muted. Say something. Cannot hear you. Can't hear you right now, Daniele. And actually, until this is figured out, yeah, I'm sorry, there seems to be an issue with the microphone now, and we're lucky that it didn't happen earlier. But Bettina had asked for the floor. Apologies that I did not see you earlier. So please, Bettina, go ahead, since you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to add something about the from our findings about the outcomes on inequality, because normally as economists talk about the macroeconomic outcomes of inequality, but we also found in our survey that it really inequality, and this is often shown also by other research, really undermines democracy and really undermines measures against the COVID crisis. We found that people who are, for example, affected by income loss are really less willing to support the measures against the crisis. For example, during the lockdown, and they are much more willing to believe in conspiracy theories. For example, we asked them whether they think that it's possible that the crisis or COVID has been invented by an elite to push through a certain political agenda. And people who suffer from income losses are much more willing to agree with this item. So this really, inequality is really a threat to democratic societies. I think this is really important to understand. And this is why this whole crisis is really a threat, given from where we are coming, and in which, especially in the US, we really have to understand that this could change. I really believe that this could change the way we are living and we are organizing our society. So this is why I really think it's a severe crisis.
And given the links between the health and the economic side, inequality then also is going to sort of threaten recovery, like from a purely economic perspective. Daniele, is your microphone back working? Try saying something. Fortunately, this doesn't seem to do anything. All right. So what I'll do is I'll continue. I'll abuse my my moderator position a little, because I also had a question. Actually, a number of questions, but I'm limiting myself to two. One is really for the entire panel. My question is: so I think as post-Keynesian economists, we're very good about the fiscal policy side of things, right? So that is where we are clear. We know, my opinion, correctly. Also with the experience from the financial crisis, we know what to do, right? Like no austerity, stabilize incomes, fight unemployment with the long-term histories effects, all of these things, right? So there we are safe. I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen. I'm not saying it's necessarily enough. My question would be, To me, this pandemic has raised deeper issues about restructuring the economy. Also, if you think more broadly in terms of climate change and the ecological crisis that we are facing simultaneously. I mean, Daniele in Fort Collins right now is, like sky is orange from the fires, right? So there is this more fundamental question. I think that is raised by this crisis a little bit more even than compared to the last crisis. So what does post-Keynesian economics have to say in your view about this restructuring, this inequality issues of, what are essential workers? How do we remunerate them? How do we ensure not the redistribution, but the pre-distribution of remunerating essential workers? And a more concrete policy question that I have for Bettina would be, you've really shown with your research and now in your presentation the return to traditional gender roles. So what do you think we should do now? So how do we link this macroeconomic analysis with a macroeconomics or a microeconomic policy response? So that would be my two questions to the panel.
So maybe I should start. I assume I see Robert in front of me, but okay. Now, Miriam, I assume you can hear me. Sorry we couldn't hear from Daniele, although he's responding in the chat to some of these questions that are coming up. So, yeah, we're going to see some restructuring in some ways. I mean, just in terms of the things that have happened over this period of time. Some people are arguing for stronger effects than others. I believe that. Some people are saying people will never is too strong, but it'll be a very, very long time for folks to forget about the dangers of the virus and how that happens, even as we hope things will get back to somewhat more normal and we won't have so many people getting sick. The experience will affect folks, choices about service sector in particular, and then this spills over to inequality, given the occupational inequalities that we actually face. Things like, using the technology we're using now and how that's going to affect something like business travel, business structures, the use of offices, things along those lines. Maybe some longer term effects there too. The question of what does the post-Keynesian economics have to say about this that's unique? I don't know that I have an immediate response to that in this respect, but I take on the point seriously about redistribution, pre-distribution, and distribution more broadly in this context. I mean, so much of in a way, I'm maybe not following the spirit of Miriam's question because I'm going back to fiscal policy in a sense where we're talking about this. But the issue really is distribution on the response side. For example, the discussion between Sebastian and Daniele about the fixed stimulus payments and how they're not as focused as they could be in many respects, and therefore the multiplier effects are lower, I think is important. So that distributional effect becomes there. And I do think there's differences from the previous crisis. I think that in some ways the experience of 2007 to 2009 has changed the perspective of economics more broadly. I think in some ways the post-Keynesian view is becoming more broadly accepted. You see this most obviously in some of the things that Larry Summers has been writing. And then lastly, going back to a point that Bettina made that she may want to come back to on this as well in terms of the issue of pre-distribution, the issue of wage differences, wage gaps that we have going forward. Why is it that women are paid less than men? Why is it that service sector workers make less than workers in other sectors, and that these inequalities continue and then they're magnified by this crisis? I think that's a huge problem, and I think it's something we do need to address. Whether it's addressed by pre-distribution or redistribution, I believe it's a hard problem. So I've said enough. I should pass it on to at least to Bettina, if not Daniele, if he can be here.
Bettina? Yeah, you're still muted. No, here you go. No, you're okay.
Yeah. Okay. It's still complicated. It's interesting how long does humanity need to learn? Yeah, restructuring the economy. I mean, this exactly, I think, something we have learned from the crisis, to see I'm looking at societies. What do societies need, and what do we need to evaluate? And the service sector, the public sector, the whole the care sector. I mean, the health sector. We have seen that this is has been underfinanced, at least in Germany, and I think also in other economies, for years. And this is really a problem, because now people, I mean, obviously are suffering. There's not enough intensive care and stuff like that. But also, as I said, it really undermines society. It really undermines the way we are living, things we really we thought we could rely on. If we go on like this and do not see how much societies do need, for example, healthcare, this will really lead us to nothing. And your second question is what can we do? I think it's actually the same answer. I think the key for the disadvantage of women, and for the also in both fields, the reproductive sphere and the productive sphere, is really the fact that they earn less for the same work. And this is maybe also important for economists, because particularly economists often argue the problem of women is that they can have children, and that they then stay at home. And if they wouldn't stay at home, they wouldn't have any problems on the labor market. But that's not the fact. The fact is that women's tasks are devaluated on the labor market. And there's even research showing that tasks at the moment they are more often provided by women become devaluated. So we do have, and this is doing gender. This is the idea that tasks provided by women are less worth, and that's a problem. And I think this is also a question, of course, how do we want to restructure the economy? Which tasks which parts of the economy do we want to evaluate and which not? So this is and that would also lead, I think, to a different distribution of care work within partnerships and within families in turn.
Thank you. Right. So what we were thinking of trying to do is have Sebastian act sort of as a stand-in for Daniele. So he's not completely shut out of the discussion here, because Daniele is very active, for those of you not following the chat, very actively answering the questions in the chat. But it's a pity if he's not heard here. So we were thinking of having Sebastian basically read Daniele's answers in the chat. But I don't have an answer whether Sebastian is very quiet yet. So I would suggest, since we have about 15 minutes left, and we will end on time to make sure everybody gets a break. Oh, Daniele, I think I hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Oh my God.
So I left and rejoined, so I'm really sorry. I don't know what happened. So with respect to Sebastian's question, my point is that the transfers were not progressive enough. This is, I think the combination of the lack of progressivity and the spending behavior of the upper income households that did not spend the money that they got is actually exacerbating inequality as opposed to alleviating it. I think so. The other thing that I was responding to, Eric, is that at the very beginning of the pandemic in February, I was thinking, okay, so this is going to require like complete restructuring of production, is going to require opening up, sort of basketball arenas for primary care and stuff like that, and it will require like giving basically a lot of money to firms to maintain their payroll expenses. And I was very skeptical about unemployment insurance initially, because I thought it would create bottlenecks when the economy recovered. And it feels like I was wrong on both counts. The empirical evidence suggests that the PPP wasn't that effective. And the reason why it wasn't that effective is that firms that had a better accounting structure a better ability to intercept these funds, they got to them first. And you need to think about entrepreneurs as like, there's inequality within entrepreneurs as well. There are people that moms and pops businesses, they might not have been able to get to the funds early on. The program ran out of funds, and this is actually, I think that's one of the reasons why the evidence points to the PPP not being that effective. And the UI, on the other hand, especially the $600 additional in extra unemployment insurance, which did like basically two things. It restored income and it prevented essential frontline workers to go back to work. This was actually a very good inequality reducing measure, if you want to look at it like that. I hope that's enough.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very happy that you were able to rejoin us on the panel here. So since we still have a number of questions, and I'm very happy that this is gearing up to be as active as our usual conferences in terms of discussion. So I'm going to take a few questions together in order to hopefully we won't be able to do all of them, but some of them. So Joachim Winters asked already a while ago, specifically to Bettina, what do you think about universal basic income? Wouldn't that be a good chance to refresh the rules and to reach more equality for care work and in relationships, because the higher income does not matter as much as now? Then we have another question by Eric Kemp-Benedict, also for Bettina, saying, interesting, so wage gaps enhance hysteresis, path-dependent changes in labor participation. Do I have that right? Right, and then I have two more, but Bettina, I would ask you to answer for now. You get this? Should I repeat?
Find the again.
Should I repeat them? So the one was UBI by Joachim Winters. What do you think about it? And the other one was the question: do wage gaps enhance hysteresis, path-dependent changes in labor participation? So do the wage gaps feed back into labor participation?
Yeah, of course, because of this bargaining processes, when women earn less, it's rational for couples to decide that they stay at home, particularly if there's a low household income. I mean, it's not only sexism, it's simply a rational consideration of couples who depend on a certain amount of household income. So yes, they do. And then, of course, I mean, this happened with the first child, and women go on parental leave. They have the wage gap between couples increases. And with the second child, it's even bargaining power of women is lower, and wage gap is even higher, and so on and so on. And then there is the divorce, and women are now I need the right word. Women are disadvantaged. I say it as obvious, as polite as I can. So, of course, there's an interrelationship. I do not believe in basic income because I really see the danger that would prevent women from taking part in the labor market, because then they would have because one mechanism is, of course, that women have earn less, and then we have the bargaining processes, but we still have processes as we call doing gender. We still have also the general idea that women are the ones who should take care for the children, who should stay at home, and that women naturally are the ones who should take care for the children. And I think when they would have a fair amount of money, much more than they would have right now if they do not work, they would stay even more often at home. So I think it would be an incentive for women to stay at home. And then we have to see that over the labor market, not only money is distributed, also, for example, power. and power within the economy, for example. And I think it would keep women away from access to power, for example, or to higher wages, which are much higher than basic income. So I think it would have a negative effect about both the wage distribution between men and women, but also access to power, for example, and to possibilities also to influence and to for example, or to policies. So I think it would actually increase inequality between men and women.
Yeah, thank you. So I would now ask two last questions, or you have two last comments, and then ask for your final remarks of the panelists in answering these as well, while answering these, hopefully. So Irima, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is commenting that in Africa, the economic sector most affected is the services sector, followed by the industrial sector. So if we widen our horizon a little beyond high-income countries, Africa, perhaps even Asia, and the dealing with the crisis, so that would be one aspect. And the other point is by Gennaro Setta, who is saying another issue which was not raised, but maybe specific to Italy, is that the shutdown has hit mainly people in the shadow economy or with part-time contracts, etc. And some of them demand that workers with decent contracts or public jobs be hit as well. So there's sort of a race to the bottom started by this crisis. The pandemic may make the labor market even more fragile. All right, shall we go in order? Steve, do you maybe want to start with final remarks?
Okay, so I wish I could say more about the low-income countries, and my experience is not so relevant there. I am concerned about the fragility that rises, that takes place here, and also, yeah, this is probably not a direct answer to the question, but just the disruption in the whole global supply chain process that's taking place through this process. I just don't think we know how that's going to come out, and so there is broadly, to use Gennaro's point, actually, a potential for some additional fragilities and uncertainties as we go along here. In terms of the shadow economy that Gennaro specifically mentions regarding Italy, if I come back to the U.S. case, this is important. Daniele mentioned about the new unemployment response in the CARES Act to deal with so-called gig workers or people who are not in the covered by the regular unemployment process. They received no benefits whatsoever institutionally prior to the crisis. And so it was good to try to address this issue in some ways, but also, as Daniele mentioned, and I should let him comment on this, but that these programs are temporary at this point. And I think with the appropriate political outcomes that we're hoping for pretty soon, that maybe that these kinds of issues will come up, just like in the Great Recession, when the fiscal policy response, I think, changed. Not necessarily that it was strong enough there, but looking back on it, I believe there was a very significant change in terms of general importance of fiscal policy in dealing with crises. It may be that what we're going through right now, and this is a rather positive statement, will have more of an effect on dealing with some of these inequalities going forward. I did want to actually, as the final remarks, I wanted just to make one point on the childcare point that Bettina has emphasized so much, and correctly so. I think one major institutional factor that we face, which is difficult, at least in the more professional sector of developed economies, is the kind of norm of full-time work. When I look at younger professional couples now with children, the stresses are huge because parents, in order to progress in their jobs, need to be working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and both of them need to be doing this. When I had young kids myself, which is now quite a while ago, but I remember thinking kind of the optimal organization would be to have 30-hour-a-week jobs for both father and mother, and 20 hours a week for the child to be in childcare, which was good up to a point, but it gets excessive when it's become 40 hours plus for the little kids. And so that's an institutional change that I think could potentially be really important. But I don't know how we make that happen kind of competitive world. We just need a different structure altogether.
Thank you. Daniele, do you want to
Sure.
next with final?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the problem with all of these measures is that they were conceived as temporary, that the political debate has shifted the conversation away from these issues, and I think that is a mistake. Not only it's basically a humanitarian mistake, not only an economic mistake. I think that, as I said in passing before, I think there's a looming fiscal crisis at the state level in the United States, because most of the states in the U.S. have a balanced budget constitutional amendments, which means that with revenues down, 20%, you name it, like expenses need to go down 20%. So there's basically built-in austerity in the state constitutions that will need to be addressed. And I think that one of the main differences between the Republican standpoint and the Democratic standpoint on the next relief package is exactly addressing the fiscal crisis at the state level. And in terms of direct transfers versus infrastructure versus other things, like you need to remember that this is especially true for the United States. Teachers will be fired because of the impending fiscal crisis. School spending will go down, and so I think one thing to look into, you can think about maybe universal childcare programs, like these things would this, I think going forward, this should be, I think it should have been at the forefront of the presidential campaign. Of course, things got in the way. With the main observation that these teachers, especially like primary school teachers, elementary school teachers, these are essential workers, and we should maintain those employment levels at all possible costs. And so since we only have we're already late, I'll leave it at here to let Bettina finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele. Bettina?
I'm sorry, I missed talking about productive and reproductive work. I just had to let my son in. No, but I think I don't have anything to add. I said my points in my last comment. So thank you for inviting me.
All right. Thanks a lot to the panelists. Since we had little discussion now of the global issues, I just wanted to remind you that tomorrow there will be a panel on global value chains, and the corona crisis. So that is something that will still be addressed at this conference. Thanks a lot to the around 250 people in the audience and that we've had throughout the session. And thanks a lot to the panelists and to the audience for the active discussion. I think in the chat there is some semblance of the deep and constructive discussions that we usually have at this conference. I very much miss heading over now with all of you into the lounge and to continue these discussions. But I very much hope that we'll be able to do so again next year. So all that remains for me to say is that now we will head into a brief break until 4:30. Unfortunately, you'll have to do all the care work that is usually provided for at these conferences yourself. But we'll see you again at 4:30 p.m. Central European Time, so in about half an hour, for a panel on green growth or degrowth. And thanks a lot again to all of you.
Thank you.